Stephen Leacock, through this essay, tries to explain that the people's need to express themselves in poetry and poetic lines is fast passing away, and we are finding simpler words and diction to express ourselves. In The Passing of the Poet, Stephen Leacock defines poetry as the art of expressing a simple truth in a concealed form of words, which may or may not rhyme. He writes about his concern about the rapid disappearance of poetry and how the poet is destined to extinct. The poet, according to him, is as old as civilization. The Greek civilizations had their poets, and even the Romans had poets. The past civilizations, whatever civilization it be, they had poets, and they loved poetry and poetic lines and poetic skills. But Stephen writes that he wanted to talk about the Victorian period when poetry was honored highly with universal esteem. The way parents recited poetry to their children and how the children recited back to their parents. And a person who did not know any poem was considered dull. Poems were written in every occasion imaginable, from love and patriotism and melancholy to torture and even swallowing and indigestion. Anybody would try their hands at poetry, even at the cost of forced and artificial rhyme scheme. During the early Victorian period, poetry was commonly recited on all occasions like birth, death, sadness, happiness, sickness, politics, to express their dejection or depression, introspection, opinion, and reflection. To show that the people of the early Victorian period used poetry excessively, Leacock gives us an example of how he found a notebook of a normal Victorian person. A pathetic Victorian gentleman, he says, attempted to compose a poem dedicating to his beloved. In that diary-like notebook of the Victorian gentleman, it was written, "Fair Lydia, could my earthly harp..." Then, dissatisfied, the gentleman strikes off that line, and underneath it he writes, "Fair Lydia, could my earthly harp..." And then strikes again, and then he writes, "Fair Lydia, should my earthly harp..." And then strikes it off again, and then writes, "Fair Lydia, did my earthly harp..." And he strikes that line again, and then finally he writes, "Fair Edith, when with fluent pen..." And then he starts his poetry, and then the line goes on. Leacock humorously points out how the poets in the early Victorian age totally ignored physical science to see wonders in simple conditions around him. You know, like he talks about a poet who saw the rising of the sun and compared it to the immortality of the soul, when rising of the sun is just a normal physical science thing that can be proved and has nothing to do with the immortality of the soul. But that poet, that Victorian poet, saw meaning in the rising of the sun, comparing it to the immortality of the soul. Next, Stephen Leacock talks about how a poet says, how a Victorian poet says, "Give me not silk, nor rich attire, nor gold, nor jewels rare." And he mocked at the poet at how he expected somebody to offer him such treasures. Leacock thus finally expressing his contentment of how during his times poets have turned from using such excessive sentiments and swelling speeches to a more practical and simple expression. To support his statement, he compares Gray's lines with Huxley's physiology, which had similar points, but Gray's was an elaborate phraseology and Huxley's was much more simpler and easily understandable. Leacock also gives another example of how Burns explains the situation of a cottage laborer who had just returned from the day's work. Such situation is explained in and much simpler words in the police news of the Dumfries Chronicles on 3rd October 1909, which explains about a prisoner who had returned home. Both Burns' story and Dumfries Chronicles story were same, but Burns was filled with poetic lines and needed a lot of effort to understand as well as to write, whereas in Dumfries Chronicles, in the police news, it was easily written and easily understood. So through the examples, Leacock points out how the poetic skills and poetic abilities and potentials are, of course, slowly becoming extinct in people of the contemporary as well as the modern generation as time passes by. In conclusion, he urges that he believes, of course, that like anything and everything, the poet is destined to be extinct, no doubt. And though he believes in the fact that the poet will soon pass, or as the title goes, passing of the poet, or in other words, that the poet is destined to extinct, however, he is not a person who would accelerate the process. He would not contribute to hurrying the process of the passing of the poet. He knows that the passing of the poet is inevitable, and yet he just wants to observe the inevitability of passing of the poet taking its own natural course. As he writes in his essay, the inevitable natural evolution which is thus shaping the mold of human thought may safely be left to its own course. Thus we find that in this whole essay, in the simplest words, Stephen Leacock through this essay explains that the people's need to express themselves in poetry and poetic lines is fast passing away, and we are trying to find, and we are finding simpler words and diction to express ourselves more clearly, and that the extinction of poets and poetry is inevitable, cannot be stopped. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.